the weight of steel. The Browning .30 caliber machine gun feels heavier than it should in the pre-dawn darkness, its frozen metal biting through Audie Murphy's wool gloves as he adjusts the weapon's position for the third time in 10 minutes. The January wind cuts across the Vosges Mountains ridge like a blade, carrying with it the smell of snow and distant cordite from yesterday's artillery exchanges. Below in the valley, the village crossroads sits silent under a thin blanket of frost, its broken rooftops catching the pale starlight that filters through the overcast sky. Murphy checks his ammunition belts again, counting rounds he knows by heart. A ritual that has kept him breathing through Sicily, Anzio, and the grinding advance through southern France. Behind him, what remains of his squad huddles in shallow scrapes carved from the rocky soil, their breath forming small clouds that dissipate quickly in the wind. Private Jenkins shifts nervously, his rifle clattering against a rock. Sergeant Williams whispers a sharp curse and tells him to keep quiet. The 3rd Infantry Division had been pushing through these mountains for weeks, clearing one German strongpoint after another in an advance measured in yards rather than miles. Murphy's company had drawn this particular piece of high ground, a nameless ridge that commanded the approaches to roads the enemy needed to threaten the division's flank. Command had promised reinforcements by mid-morning, but Murphy has learned that promises evaporate when the shooting starts and radio communications go dead. Intelligence reports suggested a German counterattack would come at dawn, and Murphy can feel the truth of it in his bones. The enemy had been too quiet yesterday, pulling back without the usual stubborn resistance that characterized every other engagement in these frozen hills. Now he understands why. They were concentrating for something bigger, something that would require his small force to hold against odds that made his stomach tighten with familiar dread. The machine gun position overlooks the narrow valley where any attack must come. Murphy had volunteered to man the weapon, partly because he understood its mechanisms better than most, but mostly because he could not bear asking another man to take the position that would draw the heaviest fire. The Browning represented both their best hope of breaking an enemy advance and a death sentence for whoever operated it when the real shooting began. As the sky begins to lighten in the east, Murphy spots the first signs of movement in the tree line across the valley. Dark shapes emerge from the winter camouflage of the forest, moving with the careful deliberation of experienced infantry. He counts 30, then 40 German soldiers, their white overcoats making them difficult to track against the snow-covered ground. Behind them, he glimpses the angular silhouette of an assault gun, its short barrel already traversing toward the American positions. Murphy knows the mathematics of what's coming. The smart tactical decision would be to fall back to secondary positions further up the slope, but retreat here means abandoning the mission entirely. The village below would fall, those roads would be lost, and other American units would pay the price for ground given up too easily. He calls softly to his men, telling them to conserve ammunition and wait for his signal. The weight of command settles on his shoulders like a familiar burden, heavier than the machine gun, heavier than the winter gear that never quite keeps the cold away. At 20, Murphy has learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite the terror that makes your hands shake and your mouth go dry. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The German attack develops with textbook precision, infantry advancing by bounds, while their assault gun provides covering fire. Murphy watches through the Browning sights as enemy soldiers use every fold in the terrain to mask their approach, admiring their skill even as he prepares to kill them. The morning light reveals more than he had hoped. At least 60 soldiers in the initial wave, with more shapes moving in the tree line behind them. Private Jenkins whispers a question about calling for artillery support, and Murphy shakes his head. Their radio operator had been wounded in yesterday's advance, and the backup radio sits silent, its batteries dead from the cold. Help, if it comes, will arrive too late to matter. This fight will be decided by what they have on hand and how long they can make their ammunition last. The assault gun fires its first round at 800 yards, the shell screaming overhead to impact somewhere behind the American positions. Murphy feels the concussion through the frozen ground and knows the enemy gunner is bracketing their location, walking rounds closer with each shot. When the range closes to 400 yards, the German infantry begins their final approach, using fire and movement tactics that speak of hard experience on the Russian front. Sergeant Williams crawls up beside Murphy, his face grim beneath his helmet's steel rim. "They're going to hit us on the flanks too," he says quietly. "I can see movement on both sides of the valley." Murphy nods, having spotted the same thing through his peripheral vision. The enemy is employing a classic double envelopment, pinning them in place with frontal fire while closing the trap from both sides. By the book, his small force should be preparing to withdraw before they're completely surrounded. "Tell the men to be ready to fall back on my word," Murphy says, though he's already making calculations that have nothing to do with retreat. The first German soldiers reach the 200-yard mark, close enough for Murphy to see individual faces beneath their helmets. Young men, most of them, probably as scared as his own troops, but driven forward by discipline, and the knowledge that turning back means facing their own officers' bullets. Murphy opens fire with the Browning, the weapon bucking against his shoulder with familiar violence. His first burst catches two enemy soldiers in the open, dropping them instantly and sending the others scrambling for whatever cover they can find. Return fire begins immediately, rifle rounds snapping overhead and splintering the logs that protect Murphy's position. The sound is sharp and angry in the cold air, punctuated by the deeper crack of the German assault gun as it continues walking rounds up the slope. For 20 minutes, the battle becomes a desperate exchange of fire across the frozen valley. Murphy works the Browning with mechanical precision, firing short bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent the barrel from overheating. His squad returns fire with rifles and their single bar, but everyone knows the machine gun represents their only chance of breaking the German attack before it reaches the ridge. When enemy infantry begins closing on both flanks, Murphy realizes conventional defensive tactics won't save them. The position will be overrun within minutes unless someone stays behind to maintain the machine gun's interlocking fields of fire. He makes the kind of decision that separates living soldiers from dead heroes, ordering his squad to fall back to prepared positions while he remains with the Browning. The weight of the weapon seems to increase as his men begin their withdrawal, each pound of steel and wood becoming heavier with the knowledge of what it represents. This isn't the first time Murphy has chosen to remain behind, and the familiar terror of isolation under fire settles over him like a cold blanket. But someone has to buy time, and mathematics dictates it should be the man best equipped to make each round count. The sound of his squad's withdrawal fades behind Murphy as he settles into the rhythm of solitary combat, traversing the Browning methodically to engage targets as they present themselves. Each muzzle flash reveals German soldiers closer than before, their winter camouflage blending with the snow-covered rocks and dead vegetation that dot the valley floor. The assault gun has found his range now, dropping high explosive rounds uncomfortably close, each impact showering him with dirt and rock fragments that sting his exposed cheeks. Private Jenkins appears suddenly at Murphy's elbow, having crawled back from the withdrawal route. "I'm staying too," the young soldier says, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Murphy shakes his head without taking his attention off the advancing Germans. "Get out of here. That's an order." "Can't hear you over the gunfire," Jenkins replies, settling in with his rifle to cover the machine gun's left flank. It's the kind of moment that makes Murphy understand why men follow orders they know might kill them, and why the weight of command never gets lighter, only more familiar. Jenkins fires carefully aimed shots at targets. Murphy can't engage with the machine gun, his rifle cracking steadily in the winter air. The boy has learned something about courage in these frozen hills, though Murphy wishes he'd learned it somewhere safer. The German assault intensifies as enemy soldiers realize they're facing only 2 Americans. Small groups begin rushing forward under covering fire, forcing Murphy to shift between targets faster than tactical doctrine recommends. The Browning's barrel starts to glow despite the cold, and he has to slow his rate of fire to prevent a dangerous overheating that would leave them defenseless at the crucial moment. A runner from company headquarters appears in their position, sliding into the shallow depression with news that makes Murphy's stomach tighten. Adjacent units have reported German armor moving up the valley roads, at least 3 tanks accompanied by infantry. The attack on Murphy's position isn't the main effort. It's a diversion meant to fix American attention, while the real blow falls elsewhere. "Captain wants you to pull back immediately," the runner gasps. "We're repositioning the whole line." Murphy looks through his sights at the German soldiers, now less than 100 yards away, then at the village crossroads below, where enemy vehicles will have to pass if they want to threaten the 3rd Infantry Division's flank. The tactical picture becomes clear with terrible simplicity. Someone has to deny the enemy those roads, at least long enough for the division to adjust its dispositions. "Tell the captain we'll hold as long as we can," Murphy says. The runner stares at him for a moment, then nods and begins crawling toward the rear. Murphy knows the man will report exactly what was said, and that those words will appear in an after-action report that transforms this morning's terror into clean military prose. But the report won't capture the weight of the decision, or the way Jenkins looks at him with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The assault gun fires again, this time close enough to shower them with frozen dirt and splinters from a shattered log. Murphy can hear German voices calling to each other as they coordinate their final rush. In a few minutes, the enemy will be close enough to use grenades, and the machine gun position will become untenable. Everything depends on making those minutes count, on buying enough time for American forces elsewhere to respond to the armored threat. Jenkins taps his shoulder and points toward the valley floor, where a German tank destroyer has appeared at the edge of the village. Its long gun traverses slowly, searching for targets among the American positions. Murphy realizes that even if they succeed in stopping the infantry attack, that vehicle will make their position impossible to hold. The mathematics of survival shift again, and Murphy finds himself calculating odds that no training manual ever prepared him to consider. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The final German rush comes with desperate intensity, enemy soldiers rising from cover to charge across the last 50 yards of open ground. Murphy works the Browning like an instrument of precise destruction, each burst claiming its targets while the barrel glows cherry red in the frozen air. Beside him, Jenkins fires as fast as he can work his rifle bolt, his shots mixing with the machine gun's chatter in a symphony of violence that echoes off the surrounding hills. A German grenade explodes 20 yards away, close enough to ring Murphy's ears and fill his mouth with the taste of cordite and frozen earth. Another lands even closer, its fragments whining overhead like angry insects. The enemy has realized they're facing only 2 men, and every remaining soldier converges on the machine gun position with the fury of troops who know they're almost through. The Browning's ammunition belt runs low with terrifying speed, each remaining round precious beyond calculation. Murphy can see German soldiers preparing for one final rush, their officers shouting commands he can't understand, but whose urgency needs no translation. When the last belt feeds through the weapon, he'll have perhaps 30 seconds before the position is overrun. Jenkins suddenly staggers, blood streaming from a head wound that leaves him dazed, but still functional. He keeps firing, though his shots go wide now, his vision blurred by blood and shock. Murphy knows they have minutes at most before the boy collapses entirely, leaving him alone with a machine gun and ammunition that won't last until full daylight. The German tank destroyer fires from the village below, its shells screaming close enough to leave Murphy's ears ringing. The vehicle's commander has spotted the muzzle flashes from their position and is attempting to destroy the machine gun with direct fire. Each round comes closer, walking up the slope with methodical precision that speaks of an experienced crew working from a stable firing position. In this moment of maximum crisis, Murphy sees something that changes everything. The tank destroyer is positioned at the village crossroads with its engine running, obviously preparing to advance once the infantry clears the American positions. Its destruction would deny the enemy their primary objective and buy precious time for the 3rd Infantry Division to reposition against the broader German attack. Murphy makes the kind of decision that will haunt his dreams for decades. He orders Jenkins to fall back while he remains with the machine gun, not to continue the defensive fight, but to cover an assault that defies every principle of tactical sanity. When the Browning's final ammunition belt feeds through the weapon, instead of withdrawing, Murphy prepares to advance toward the tank destroyer. The machine gun falls silent as the last rounds disappear into the German ranks, and Murphy destroys the weapon's firing mechanism to prevent its capture. Around him, enemy voices grow closer, but the delay has served its purpose. Every German soldier in the valley knows exactly where he is, which means they're focused on his position instead of scanning for other threats. What happens next will be written in after-action reports and citation language, but the official words will never capture the terror and desperate calculation that drives Murphy down the slope toward the village. Moving through terrain he memorized during the long night, he uses every fold in the ground to mask his approach, knowing that surprise represents his only advantage against a vehicle that outguns him by any reasonable measure. The weight of the demolished machine gun seems to follow him down the slope, its burden now transformed from defensive anchor to offensive inspiration. Behind him, German voices call out coordinates and target descriptions, but they're looking for a machine gun position that no longer exists, buying him precious seconds of confusion in which to close the distance to the village crossroads. The secret that will never appear in any official report is how Murphy's hands shook as he approached the tank destroyer, his body betraying a terror so profound it threatened to freeze him in place just when movement meant the difference between success and death. The German vehicle sat at the crossroads like a metal predator, its crew scanning the American positions for targets, while infantry continued their assault up the slope toward the now silent machine gun position. Murphy had salvaged 2 grenades and his carbine from the defensive position, hardly enough firepower to threaten an armored vehicle under normal circumstances. But the tank destroyer's crew had left their commander's hatch open for better visibility, and Murphy understood that sometimes warfare came down to opportunities measured in seconds and chances that appeared only once. The approach took an eternity that lasted perhaps 3 minutes, Murphy moving through drainage ditches and behind stone walls, while German infantry tramped past his hiding places. At one point, an enemy soldier stopped within arm's reach to light a cigarette, his hands cupped around the flame, while Murphy pressed himself against frozen earth and tried to control his breathing. What the citation would later call conspicuous gallantry felt like barely controlled panic, each movement forward requiring a conscious decision to keep functioning, despite every instinct screaming for retreat. Murphy's training had prepared him for many things, but not for the weight of knowing that his actions in the next few minutes would determine whether other Americans lived or died in battles they hadn't even fought yet. The tank destroyer's engine noise covered his final approach, its crew focused on targets up the slope rather than threats from the village itself. Murphy climbed onto the vehicle's rear deck with movements that felt clumsy and too loud, though later he would realize his feet made no sound at all on the metal plating. The commander remained visible through the open hatch, his attention fixed on the ridge where Jenkins was still drawing fire with deliberately aimed shots. Murphy armed both grenades and dropped them through the hatch in a sequence that took less than 5 seconds, but stretched in his memory like hours of slow-motion terror. The explosions came as muffled thumps followed by screaming, and the tank destroyer's engine died with a grinding finality that left the crossroads suddenly quiet, except for the distant rifle fire from the slope above. What happened next became the part of the story Murphy never told anyone, not even in the whispered conversations that sometimes happened between combat veterans decades after the war ended. He sat on the destroyed vehicle for almost a minute, his body shaking with reaction and exhaustion, while German voices called out confused questions from positions throughout the village. The boy from Texas had just killed at least 3 men at arm's length, and the weight of that reality pressed down on him with a force that made breathing difficult. But the tank destroyer's deck-mounted machine gun remained functional, and Murphy could see German infantry beginning to withdraw from their assault on the ridge as news of their support vehicle's destruction spread through their ranks. He took position behind the weapon and began engaging targets of opportunity, each burst fired with mechanical precision, while his mind struggled to process what he had done and what it would mean. The weight of the tank destroyer's steel deck beneath him felt heavier than the machine gun had on the ridge. Heavier because it represented a line he had crossed from defender to something else entirely. The official reports would make it sound like tactical genius, but Murphy knew it was something more desperate and human than that. A young man's refusal to let others die for ground that could still be held. Hours later, when American reinforcements arrived to find the village secure and the German attack broken, Murphy was still sitting on the destroyed tank destroyer. The steel deck had grown cold beneath him, but he seemed unable or unwilling to move from the position that had become his unwilling throne. Private Jenkins found him there, the boy's head wound bandaged, but his eyes clear enough to understand what had happened in the village below. "The captain's looking for you," Jenkins said quietly. "Says there's going to be paperwork." Murphy nodded but didn't immediately stand. The tank destroyer's deck gun pointed toward empty positions where German soldiers had been an hour before, its barrel now cold and silent. Around them, the village crossroads showed the debris of brief, violent action, scattered equipment, abandoned weapons, and the kind of evidence that would be cleaned up and forgotten while the official reports lived on in filing cabinets. Captain Morrison arrived with a headquarters clerk and a camera, the kind of aftermath that Murphy had learned to expect but never grew comfortable with. The captain walked around the destroyed tank destroyer with professional interest, examining the damage and making notes for his report. When he asked Murphy to explain exactly what had happened, the words came slowly, stripped of emotion, and carefully focused on tactics rather than the terror that still made his hands shake. The clerk wrote everything down in the precise language that would transform the morning's chaos into neat paragraphs, suitable for higher headquarters. Murphy watched the process with growing unease, recognizing that each sentence moved the reality of what happened further from his memory of cold steel and desperate choices. The official version sounded heroic. The lived experience felt like something else entirely. 2 months later, when the citation reached him at a rear area hospital where he was recovering from wounds received in a later action, Murphy read the formal language with the detachment of someone examining a story about a stranger. The words described tactical innovation and conspicuous gallantry, but they couldn't capture the weight of sitting alone on a tank destroyer while German voices called out in the growing daylight. Jenkins visited him in the hospital, bringing news from the company and a bottle of whiskey smuggled past the medical staff. "You know what they're saying about that morning, don't you?" Jenkins asked. Murphy shook his head, though he could guess. "They're saying it was impossible, that one man couldn't have done all that and walked away." The 2 men sat in silence for a while, sharing the whiskey and watching snow fall outside the hospital windows. The Vosges Mountains were behind them now, along with the village crossroads and the tank destroyer that had probably been hauled away for scrap metal. But the weight of that morning remained, settling into Murphy's memory like winter cold that never quite left his bones. Years later, when reporters asked him about the actions that earned his decorations, Murphy would speak briefly about tactical necessity and the importance of supporting your fellow soldiers. He never mentioned the way his hands shook, or the weight of steel deck plates under his boots, or the dreams that sometimes brought back the sound of German voices in a village crossroads that existed now only in his memory and the precise language of military reports. The true weight of heroism, Murphy learned, wasn't carried in medal cases or citation folders. It lived in the spaces between official words, in the silence that followed questions about what it felt like to cross lines that other men never had to consider. The machine gun on the ridge and the tank destroyer in the village had both been tools of war, but they became something heavier in memory, symbols of choices that changed not just tactical situations, but the men who made them. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.